I'm Alex Lawson, filling in for Thom, and I am joined on the line by Alex Zaitchik. He is an amazing journalist, the author of a couple books. The most recent one, The Gilded Rage, A Wild Ride Through Donald Trump's America. Alex, thanks for joining us on the Thom Hartmann program.
Always great to be here.
So we're talking about a new piece that you just published on Colombia. Just kind of walk us through it. It's a fascinating piece of reporting.
Thanks. Yeah, it represents an attempt to give voice to a population that almost never really gets much attention out of Latin America, and that is the indigenous populations that tend to live in the Amazonian regions of those countries with significant amounts of rainforests. And basically, it presents their view of the headline-making peace accord, which just narrowly failed the other week in Colombia, that would basically disband FARC and end the war that's destroyed so much of the country for the last 50 years. And the Indians have a very different take on that, because the peace accord is part of a long-term government strategy for the South, which is basically to ratchet up extractive investment, meaning exactly what that sounds like, which is mining and oil. So they are happy that the war is.
So Alex, let me just because yeah. I had no idea of this until you told me about it, and I read your piece, and then I seeing the peace accord, and this isn't making a judgment on the peace accord, but it makes a lot of sense. It makes it make more sense that there is that the peace accord is good. There, the end of half of a century of armed conflict. You get to kind of why or how did it get there, besides just people being exhausted in some fashion. That's where my brain was. But there is an opportunity to monetize the area that has been a conflict region. And that there are tremendous, I'm putting in air quotes, resources to be pulled out of those areas, these rainforests, and that is actually a part of why a peace accord was able to happen.
Yeah, precisely. And it's important to look at the sort of broader context of all this. Basically, you have Colombia entering the third decade of the sort of neoliberal transformation of the economy that started under this guy Gaviria in the early 90s. And it involved free trade agreements, increasing concentration in land ownership, more focus on oil and mining and export of those resources at the expense of domestic agriculture. And it has basically been a disaster for the peasantry, for indigenous groups around Colombia. The indigenous populations of the South have kind of been shielded from it, ironically, because of the conflict. It sort of served as a protective buffer to those rainforests, which are quite extensive. But now you have the sort of return of history with the post-conflict period, and you're going to have this commodities boom, which has already destroyed the rainforests in the neighboring countries like Ecuador and Peru, sort of moving in and sort of subsuming Colombia as well. And the piece that I wrote was from a organizing meeting of something like 35 tribes in the area coming together to talk about how to organize politically to resist this, and also present an alternative development model, which they do have, and which is starting to get more traction among Western economists who are concerned not only with climate change, but also helping preserve the cultures of these communities that are under assault.
So, Alex, I should have done this at the top, but where can people find this and read this piece?
It's on takepart.com, which is a very good environmental and social justice website out of Los Angeles.
And the title is When Peace is Dangerous. Since I am one of your biggest fans, Alex, I read I think everything you write, unless something sneaks by my Google alert on your name, which I suggest everybody put on because Alex's journalism is amazing. You've covered this. You've seen the future, what happens in a neighboring country, in Ecuador, right?
Yeah, I've covered land use conflicts related to mega mining in Ecuador. I've covered tribal politics in Peru and now Colombia. Yeah.
What about just in the Ecuador, which seems somewhat analogous, right? What does it look like when these extractive industries come in, when big oil comes in? And, because there's going to be some sort of picture of, oh, well, it's investment or something, right? Oh, it's going to create jobs the environmental destruction can't be that bad.
For one, I mean, in the northeast of Ecuador, the most famous case that most people are probably familiar with is the Chevron pollution in the northeast of the country, which has just been absolutely apocalyptic. I've traveled through communities that, had skyrocketing rates of cancers, something along the lines of what you find in Chernobyl. In fact, some people call Chevron's legacy there the Amazon Chernobyl.
Which you actually have been to Chernobyl area as well, right?
Yeah, I've been through areas contaminated with radiation.
So you're making that comparison with knowledge that is actually an environmental devastation occurring at that level.
Absolutely, yeah. And these people feel equally forlorn and forgotten. Often these environmental disasters don't even get covered in the urban media of the countries in which they take place. Like you have these sort of, the capital city looks at the Amazon regions of Ecuador or Peru as kind of like these wild west, savage kind of parts of, they're almost like another planet. So they're really underrepresented unless there's an enormous amount of dramatic death and destruction. It doesn't really get any coverage. And these communities aren't just fighting for health, but they take their cultural heritage very seriously. And their culture is dependent on the forest for everything from, spiritual rituals to hunting, fishing. This is how they've lived for centuries, if not millennia. And when these big companies come in and pollute the rivers and cut down the trees for agribusiness or strip mining, the impacts are wide. And it's not just the location of the mine, but they have downriver, literally and figuratively, effects that affect communities for many hundreds of miles. And you see that especially right now in Peru and the Marañón, which is a major tributary of the Amazon, by the way, and risks huge impacts in the whole Amazon watershed. Communities living up and down these drill sites, and they're just being devastated. Kids, dying. Just awful, tragic stories. And,
with the Chevron, because I like your optimism that most people know the story, but I don't think they do. I don't think that many people. I mean, I think Thom's listeners are probably informed more than most, but. Also, Chevron, they basically came in, they destroyed ecosystems, and then they left. And
the entire northeastern quadrant of Ecuador was opened up by then Texaco. Chevron bought Texaco in the 90s and took on the lawsuit that had been launched against Texaco for restitution in payments to the tribes that had seen their lands destroyed. And basically, they didn't even pretend to adhere to any sort of environmental standard that they would have had to, worked by in the U.S. or any other country. They just dumped the toxic waste directly into the river. And they did this for decades, throughout the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s. And then they just pulled stakes and left. And the Ecuadorian government that okayed all of this was basically a military junta. It was completely corrupt, and they never had to face any consequences for it. So there's a lawsuit, a massive class action lawsuit that's currently made its way to Canada. It got thrown out in the United States after the Ecuadorian Supreme Court granted the communities billions of dollars, $12 billion, the biggest environmental judgment in history. It's a huge, long, globe straddling complex legal story. But the short of it is right now they're in Canada. The tribes are trying to get the Canadian government to force Chevron to pay the settlement out of its Canadian tar sands assets, which are enormous.
And so, and I mean, one of the things that stuck with me was that they removed all assets from the country so that the judgment that was against them, which they knew because they were dumping things into the river, but so that there was nothing to claim. And that's why it's moved to different jurisdictions. And, you know, then they obviously have some number crunchers who are saying it's actually just cheaper to just keep moving this jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And they, you know, they're hoping never to pay off. So I like to have hope when I talk about things. And so you alluded to it, but, and I want to see if there's things that people can do. But you said that there is a sort of counterweight that if with the knowledge that this is coming in Southern Colombia, what kind of forces are there to make sure that it's not the worst case scenario of environmental destruction there?
Well, you're starting to see a lot of cross-border organizing among indigenous tribes. They look at other tribes in other countries as their cousins. They think of themselves as one big indigenous family, and they're starting to organize as such with that political insight in mind. You're also starting to see allies and advocates from around the world come together to try to, increase their voice and provide them with data for their alternatives. And you're starting to see that more and more. For example, the World Resources Institute, which is a great nonprofit based in D.C., is producing literature where they've had resource economists study the economic and ecological benefits of securing land title among the indigenous communities, as they're supposed to be secured anyway, according to the UN Charter, but often are ignored in practice. And what they're finding is that sustainable industries are producing as much economic or more benefit to the countries over the long term, as opposed to just destroying the land for a 5 to 10 year mining operation. And it's also reducing conflict, obviously. And the economic benefit is just enormous. I mean,
something really like that.
Nothing like, other than oceans, there's no other carbon capture or carbon storage technology as cost effective or as proven on a massive scale as rainforests. It's really the low hanging fruit in the climate battle. Something,
we have 1 minute left here. Something like an alternative revenue model, I believe, is happening in Brazil with yerba mate and some indigenous tribes, which is a local caffeinated beverage that they've created a sustainable business model around. And it is not, an extractive slash and burn style revenue stream from these rainforests, which is what they were kind of faced with in that part of the world. Is that similar to what people are talking about here as well?
That's a great example. Yeah, there are all sorts of things like that, everything from crafts to local plants that can be used for, healthcare products or, energy drinks or nutritious foods. In Guatemala, there's one of the best examples of this. I also covered that up in Patan, the famous rainforest area where the Tikal.
Alex, can you stick with us through this break into the next segment?
Sure thing.
Fantastic. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann program. I'm Alex Lawson, filling in for Thom, and we will be right back after this. And we're back on the Thom Hartmann program. I'm Alex Lawson, filling in for Thom. We have Alex Zaitchik on the phone talking about his new article that you can find at takepart.com, When Peace is Dangerous, about the situation in Southern Colombia. Alex, we only have about a minute and a half in this segment, but I wanted to let you finish your thought there.
Yeah, I was just saying that there is more effort being put into amplifying the voices of the indigenous population of the Amazon countries, who are the natural defenders of the rainforest, which is a global issue, obviously, and they're already there. In many cases, they have indigenous tribal security forces that can monitor the forest for illegal logging and illegal mining, and they just need help, international development assistance, climate funds, people being aware of their problem and how their fight is also our fight. And, it's not just about, activists saying we should help these people because it's a good thing to do. There's actually a strong economic argument for securing their land claims and giving them what they need. And the World Resources Institute is a great place to go and learn more about this.
The World Resources Institute.
Mm-hmm.
So, Alex, thanks so much for coming on and talking about your reporting. I hope that you will come back and talk about the next great piece of journalism that you create. I want people to go and buy your latest book, The Gilded Rage. You can find that in your local bookstore. You can go to barnesandnobles.com. You can go to amazon.com, wherever you want. You find Gilded Rage by Alex Zaitchik. Read that book. Alex, thanks for joining us on the Thom Hartmann program.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much, Alex.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann program. I'm Alex Lawson, filling in for Thom, and we will be right back after this.